We cultivate intellectual sophistication at Westridge Academy, not soil and crops. Your humble background simply doesn't align with our standard of academic distinction." The scathing words reverberated through Chancellor Montgomery's mahogany-panelled office as 18-year-old Olivia Mason clutched her rejection letter, her hands trembling. But 3 weeks later, when a gleaming private jet emblazoned with Mason Global Enterprises touched down on the pristine athletic field of the campus, the Chancellor's condescending smile vanished as an elderly gentleman in an impeccably tailored suit descended the aircraft's steps. "I'm William Mason, CEO of Mason Global Enterprises and Olivia's grandfather. I believe we need to discuss your admissions practices before my company finalizes its $50 million innovation grant to any university this year. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Westridge Academy stood as a monument to academic elitism in the scenic coastline of New England. Its marble-columned buildings and perfectly landscaped grounds represented generations of privilege, where legacy admissions and carefully curated social connections determined who belonged. The university proudly advertised its commitment to diverse perspectives. Though this diversity rarely extended to students from rural America, Chancellor Richard Montgomery presided over undergraduate admissions with unquestioned authority. At 58, with his British-tailored suits and connections to America's most influential families, he had transformed Westridge into an increasingly exclusive enclave over his 15-year tenure. His reputation for maintaining standards had made it the most selective private university on the East Coast, boasting an acceptance rate below 5% and the highest concentration of students from the nation's top 1% of earners. The Office of Admissions reflected this philosophy perfectly, walls adorned with portraits of distinguished alumni, trophy cases displaying academic achievements, and a bronze plaque beside the Chancellor's door that simply stated, "Excellence, Tradition, Legacy." Chancellor Montgomery moved through the admissions department on a bright March morning, his Italian leather shoes clicking against imported marble floors as he addressed his team of admissions officers. "I'm pleased to report that our acceptance rate has dropped to a historic low of 3.8%, he announced with undisguised satisfaction. "This places us above even our Ivy League competitors in terms of selectivity." The admissions team nodded appreciatively. The university's exclusivity determined everything from national rankings to alumni donations. As they were concluding their meeting, Montgomery's assistant entered with a concerned expression. "I apologize for the interruption, Chancellor, but there's an applicant here who insists on speaking with you personally. I explained that decisions are final, but she's quite persistent." Montgomery frowned, his perfectly groomed silver eyebrows drawing together. "Who is it?" "Olivia Mason from Clearwater Valley Rural Scholarship applicant." A flicker of recognition crossed Montgomery's face. "Ah, yes, the farm girl with the surprisingly strong test scores." He sighed with practiced patience. "Very well, I can spare 5 minutes. Perhaps it will serve as a teaching moment about accepting limitations." Minutes later, Olivia Mason entered Montgomery's immaculate office. At 18, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had shouldered significant responsibility throughout her young life. Her clothes were modest, but clean, a simple blazer over a button-down shirt and neat slacks rather than designer labels. In her hands, she clutched a Westridge rejection letter and a thin folder of additional materials. "Thank you for seeing me, Chancellor Montgomery," Olivia began, her Midwestern accent subtle but detectable. "I believe there may have been an oversight. Regarding my application," Montgomery gestured to a chair, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Miss Mason, I appreciate your determination, but I assure you every application receives thorough consideration. Our decisions are final. According to your own published criteria, my qualifications exceed your admission standards, Olivia replied, evenly. I'm valedictorian with a 4.0 GPA, perfect ACT scores, 12 AP exams, all with scores of 5, and research experience that resulted in co-authorship in the Journal of Environmental Science. Montgomery's expression remained unchanged. Our admissions process considers many factors beyond mere numbers, Miss Mason. Westridge seeks students who will contribute to our unique campus culture and demonstrate exceptional achievement in areas. We value. Which areas are those exactly? Olivia asked, her tone respectful but direct. Your materials emphasize academic excellence, research experience, leadership, and community impact. I've documented all of these in my application. Miss Mason, excellence is contextual, Montgomery sighed. Leading a small-town environmental initiative or winning a rural science fair simply doesn't carry the same weight as the achievements our successful applicants demonstrate. Students from less traditional educational backgrounds often struggle with the rigorous academic and social environment at Westridge. Olivia opened her folder and placed several documents on the desk. I've brought additional information about my research work on sustainable agriculture practices. The methods I helped develop are currently being implemented in 4 counties and have increased crop yield by 30% while reducing water consumption. Professor Williams from your Environmental Sciences Department expressed interest in this work. In our correspondence, she added, placing an email printout on top of the stack. Montgomery barely glanced at the papers. I'm sure it's very practical work. However, Westridge's environmental program emphasizes theoretical innovation and policy formation, not hands-on agricultural techniques. Our graduates typically move into research institutions or policy organizations, not back to family farms. My research isn't about farming techniques, Olivia countered, frustration flickering across her face. It's about sustainable environmental innovation that addresses food security challenges in changing climate conditions. The paper was cited by researchers at Berkeley and Johns Hopkins last year. Nevertheless, Montgomery replied with finality, we simply don't believe Westridge is the right environment for you. Olivia sat straighter. Is it because I'm from a farming family, or because I don't have legacy connections or donor potential? Montgomery's smile turned cold. Miss Mason, your insinuations are inappropriate. Westridge values merit above all else. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I believe our time is up. I wish you the best at one of your state institutions, where you'll likely find a more suitable environment. As Olivia gathered her untouched documents, Montgomery added with practiced condescension, not everyone is cut out for elite education. There's no shame in finding your appropriate level. My appropriate level is wherever the best education is offered, Olivia replied, meeting the Chancellor's eyes directly. I came here not because Westridge is my only option, but because your environmental sciences program aligned with my research interests. We cultivate intellectual sophistication at Westridge Academy, not soil and crops, Montgomery said dismissively. Your humble background simply doesn't align with our standard of academic distinction. Our discussion is concluded. With quiet dignity, Olivia collected her papers and stood. Thank you for your time, Chancellor. I think I understand Westridge's values much more clearly now. As the door closed, Montgomery returned to his computer, already dismissing the encounter from his mind. He had dozens of emails from prominent families expressing gratitude for their children's acceptance letters and a prestigious institution to protect from those who simply didn't belong in its rarefied atmosphere. Outside in the parking lot, Olivia sat in her weathered pickup truck, her composure finally breaking as tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She had expected the rejection letter, but had hoped that presenting her additional research might make a difference. Now she understood that no amount of academic achievement could overcome the invisible barriers of background and status. She pulled out her phone and called home. "Grandpa, it's me. The meeting went exactly as you predicted." No, he wouldn't even look at the additional research documentation. Yes, he actually said they cultivate intellectual sophistication, not soil. "And crops," she listened for a moment. "Don't worry about it, I've got other options. Yale and Princeton both accepted me, and their environmental science programs are actually stronger in sustainable innovation." As Olivia drove away, she didn't notice Chancellor Montgomery watching from his office window, a satisfied expression on his face. In Montgomery's mind, he had maintained Westridge's standards by filtering out students who wouldn't properly reflect the institution's prestigious image. He had no idea that his smug certainty was about to be dramatically challenged in less than a month. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. April had transformed Westridge Academy into a showcase of elite academia. Cherry blossoms lined the cobblestone pathways, historic buildings gleamed in the spring sunshine, and students in designer casual wear lounged on manicured lawns, the perfect picture of privileged higher education. Preparations for the university's annual Benefactors Weekend were nearly complete, with banners proclaiming "Shaping Tomorrow's Visionaries" strategically placed to impress the wealthy donors soon to arrive. Chancellor Richard Montgomery was in his element, having spent weeks orchestrating every detail of the weekend's events. The Benefactors Gala would showcase Westridge's most impressive students and faculty, with carefully rehearsed presentations designed to loosen checkbooks and secure the endowments that maintained the university's exclusive status. The new technology center is still $3 million short, he reminded his development team during their final planning meeting. Ensure that the Blackwells and the Richardsons are seated with Professor Hayworth. His quantum computing breakthroughs impress the tech industry crowd. His assistant nodded, making notes on her tablet. "And the proposed environmental innovation. Complex?" asked the Vice President of Development. "Ah, yes," Montgomery smiled. "Make sure all the sustainability-focused donors see the architectural renderings. $80 million for state-of-the-art facilities that will position Westridge as a leader in environmental policy and research. We're in discussions with several candidates to head the new department, all with impeccable Ivy League credentials." The meeting adjourned with Montgomery feeling supremely confident. Years of cultivating the right connections had positioned Westridge Academy at the center of elite academic circles, and this weekend would cement relationships with donors who could fund the next decade of expansion. He had personally vetted the guest list, ensuring that only those with appropriate influence and resources received invitations. The first sign that something unusual was happening came shortly after lunch. Montgomery was crossing the main quadrangle when he noticed students gathering at the windows of the student center, pointing toward the sky. The distant sound of an aircraft broke the carefully cultivated tranquility of the campus atmosphere. His administrative assistant hurried across the lawn, phone in hand. "Chancellor Montgomery, campus security is calling. There's a situation that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" Montgomery asked, irritation creeping into his voice. The Benefactors Weekend required perfection, and unexpected disruptions were not acceptable. "They say there's a private jet circling the campus. It's requesting permission to land on the athletic field. Security tried to refuse, but they have some kind of university authorization." "Authorization? That's impossible. We don't allow aircraft on campus without specific—" His words cut off as he caught sight of what was approaching. Banking gracefully through the clear blue sky was a sleek Gulfstream G650, its polished exterior gleaming in the sunlight. As it descended lower, the distinctive logo of Mason Global Enterprises became visible on its tail, a stylized M that was recognized worldwide. The jet continued its controlled descent toward the open expanse of the Academy's pristine athletic field. Students were already streaming out of buildings, phones raised to capture the unusual spectacle. Faculty members stood in clusters, watching with expressions ranging from confusion to curiosity as the aircraft made its deliberate approach toward the center of campus. "Call security again," Montgomery ordered. "Tell them to prevent that landing immediately and redirect the aircraft to the municipal airport where it belongs." His assistant made the call, then looked up with consternation. "They say they can't. Apparently, the President's office authorized this landing for a special presentation related to the Environmental Innovation Complex fundraising campaign. It was coordinated directly through President Harlow's office." "That's absurd," Montgomery snapped. "I oversee all donor events, and there's nothing about a private jet landing on our schedule. Get President Harlow on the phone immediately." But it was too late to prevent what was unfolding. The impressive aircraft had touched down smoothly on the athletic field, where groundskeepers had hastily removed several soccer goals to create sufficient landing space. The jet taxied to a stop near the edge of the field, closest to the main academic buildings, its engines winding down as a small staircase extended from its side. Students gathered in growing numbers, many taking selfies with the luxurious aircraft in the background. The door of the jet opened, and a distinguished man in his 70s descended the stairs with remarkable vigor for his age. His tailored suit contrasted with the casual campus setting, but he moved with the confidence of someone equally at home in boardrooms and ballrooms. A small team of professionals in crisp business attire emerged behind him, carrying presentation materials and digital tablets. As a stunned Montgomery watched from the steps of the administration building, the elderly gentleman approached the growing crowd and began to speak with several faculty members from the Environmental Sciences Department. They greeted him with evident respect and enthusiasm, shaking his hand and gesturing toward the main campus with obvious excitement. "Who is that?" Montgomery demanded of no one in particular. Professor Williams from the Environmental Sciences Department overheard his question as he hurried past. "That's William Mason, Chancellor, CEO of Mason Global Enterprises, and one of the most influential figures in sustainable technology development. His company holds more patents in renewable energy systems than any other corporation in the world." Mason. The name registered immediately, sending a wave of unease through him, as in Olivia Mason's grandfather. "Yes," Williams confirmed, continuing toward the gathering. "The president invited him to showcase his company's environmental technologies as part of the fundraising weekend. It's quite a coup for Westridge. Mason Global rarely partners with academic institutions." Montgomery stood frozen, watching as William Mason expertly engaged with students and faculty, explaining concepts with the practiced ease of both a businessman and an educator. The crowd around him grew, drawn by his charismatic presence and the impressive credentials of his team. His assistant returned, looking worried. "President Harlow isn't answering, but his secretary says he's on his way to meet Mr. Mason now. Apparently, Mason Global Enterprises is considering a major research endowment for environmental innovation, and several universities are competing for the partnership." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Montgomery recalled his dismissive treatment of Olivia Mason weeks earlier, the casual way he had rejected not just the student, but the entire notion that environmental expertise from rural America might have value in Westridge's rarefied academic environment. As if summoned by his thoughts, he spotted Olivia among the crowd. engaged in animated conversation with several faculty members while gesturing towards some digital renderings displayed on a large tablet. Unlike their previous meeting, Olivia now moved with complete confidence, clearly in her element, as she explained technical details to interested professors. Before Montgomery could decide how to respond, he saw President Harlow striding across. The green hand extended to greet William Mason. The university's distinguished leader was smiling broadly, his body language communicating both respect and eagerness as he welcomed the important visitor. Gathering his composure, Montgomery made his way toward the gathering, positioning himself to intercept the president and insert himself into the conversation. Years of navigating academic politics had taught him the art of managing unexpected situations while maintaining an appearance of control. "Mr. Mason, what an unexpected pleasure," he began, as he approached the group, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "I'm Chancellor Richard Montgomery, head of admissions. Had I known you were planning this impressive demonstration, I would have personally ensured appropriate arrangements were made." William Mason turned to face him, his expression pleasant but unreadable. "Chancellor Montgomery, yes, I believe you've met my granddaughter Olivia." President Harlow looked between them with interest. "You're already acquainted." "Excellent. Chancellor, Montgomery is one of our most valued administrators, responsible for selecting the exceptional students who make Westridge what it is today." "Indeed," Mason replied evenly. Olivia and Chancellor Montgomery had quite an illuminating conversation about Westridge's values when she received her rejection letter last month. A momentary silence fell over the group. President Harlow's smile faltered slightly as he glanced at Montgomery. "Rejection letter. Mr. Mason, there must be some misunderstanding. With Olivia's exceptional credentials and your family's distinguished background in environmental innovation, she would be exactly the kind of student Westridge seeks to attract." "That wasn't the impression she received," Mason replied, his tone remaining measured but with steel beneath the polite exterior. In fact, Chancellor Montgomery was quite explicit that Westridge cultivates intellectual sophistication, not soil and crops, and that Olivia's humble background doesn't align with their standard of academic distinction. The blood drained from Montgomery's face as his own words were quoted back to him in front of the university president and an increasingly interested circle of faculty and students. Smartphones had appeared, recording the interaction, though he was too focused on the unfolding disaster to notice. "There must be some context missing from that exchange," he managed, looking desperately to President Harlow for support. "Our admissions process is highly competitive, and we consider many factors, like family background and social status." Mason suggested mildly. "Those seem to be the deciding factors in Olivia's case, despite her perfect academic record and published research." President Harlow's expression had transformed from confusion to alarm. "Mr. Mason, I assure you this doesn't reflect Westridge's institutional values. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in my office, where—" "Actually," Mason interrupted politely, "I believe this is exactly the right venue for this conversation. Your beautiful campus green, surrounded by your students and faculty, with our aircraft as backdrop." He gestured to the impressive jet. "After all, isn't education about bringing different worlds together, corporate innovation meeting academic tradition?" Olivia had approached during this exchange and now stood beside her grandfather, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to Montgomery's growing discomfort. "Mr. President," Mason continued, "I came here today not just to showcase our technologies, but to discuss a potential $50 million research endowment for environmental innovation. Mason Global is establishing partnerships with universities that demonstrate genuine commitment to bridging theoretical research with practical applications, institutions that value knowledge regardless of its source." President Harlow nodded eagerly, which is exactly what Westridge strives to do, Mr. Mason. Our proposed environmental innovation complex will revolutionize. But that's not what you currently do, is it? Mason interrupted gently. Not if your admissions chancellor believes that rural environmental expertise is inherently less valuable than urban academic credentials. Not if brilliant students like my granddaughter are rejected because they come from farming backgrounds rather than preparatory schools. The crowd had grown, and Montgomery realized with horror that several major donors who had arrived early for the weekend were among those listening intently to the exchange. The narrative he had carefully constructed about Westridge's values and mission was unraveling before his eyes. "I'm not here seeking special treatment for Olivia," William Mason continued, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "She's already accepted offers from Yale and Princeton, both of which recognize the value of her research and background." The mention of these prestigious competitors sent a visible ripple through the assembled Westridge administrators. "I'm here because your president expressed interest in Mason Global's educational endowment, and I needed to determine whether Westridge's stated commitment to environmental innovation is genuine or merely a convenient fundraising narrative." He turned slightly, ensuring his next words carried to the assembled crowd. "I believe we need to discuss your admissions practices and institutional values before my company finalizes its $50 million research endowment to any university this year." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Faculty members exchanged glances, donors whispered to each other, and students continued recording on their smartphones. The entire scene unfolding as a masterclass in how quickly an institution's carefully crafted image could unravel. President Harlow, a veteran of academic crisis management, stepped forward smoothly. "Mr. Mason, your concerns are entirely valid and deserve our fullest attention. Westridge prides itself on continuous improvement, and clearly we have an opportunity before us." He gestured toward the administration building. "Perhaps we could continue this important conversation in my office with the appropriate department heads present." Mason glanced at his granddaughter, who gave a slight nod. "That would be acceptable, Mr. President, provided Chancellor Montgomery joins us. After all, admissions policies appear to be at the heart of our discussion." As the group moved toward the administration building, the buzz of conversation erupted behind them. Montgomery, walking stiffly alongside President Harlow, could practically feel his 15-year career at Westridge crumbling with each step. The carefully constructed world of academic exclusivity he had built was facing a challenge he hadn't anticipated: accountability from outside the ivory tower. In President Harlow's spacious office, with its wall of windows overlooking the campus, the tension was palpable. Joining them were the Dean of Environmental Sciences, the Vice President of Development, and Professor Williams, who had corresponded with Olivia about her research. Montgomery took a seat as far from the Masons as propriety allowed. "Mr. Mason," President Harlow began, "first, let me say that Westridge is honored by your visit and interest in our programs. If there's been a misunderstanding regarding your granddaughter's application, I assure you we can address it immediately." "This isn't about securing a spot for Olivia," William Mason replied, his tone firm but not hostile. "As I mentioned, she's already committed to Yale. This is about understanding whether Westridge's institutional values align with Mason Global's mission before we commit significant resources to any university." He motioned to one of his associates, who handed him a tablet. "We've been researching potential academic partners for our next-generation environmental sustainability initiative. We need an institution that genuinely values innovation wherever it originates, not one that dismisses rural expertise while claiming to champion diversity of thought." President Harlow nodded thoughtfully. I completely understand your concern. While I believe Westridge does value diverse perspectives, it's clear we may have blind spots in our processes. He glanced pointedly at Montgomery. Perhaps, Chancellor, Montgomery could explain the specific factors that influence the decision regarding Olivia's application. Montgomery cleared his throat, years of administrative training kicking in as he attempted to salvage the situation. As I explained to Miss Mason during our meeting, our holistic review process considers many factors beyond academic credentials. We assess fit with our unique campus culture, potential for contribution to our community, and background, Olivia interjected quietly. All eyes turned to her. When you rejected my application, you made it clear that my rural upbringing was incompatible with Westridge's standards of intellectual sophistication. You didn't evaluate my research or achievements on their merits. You evaluated them through the lens of where they originated. Professor Williams leaned forward. If I may, I've reviewed Olivia's research on sustainable water management systems. Her work combines theoretical elegance with practical implementation in a way that's sadly rare in our field. The system she developed for her family's farm has been adapted for 4 neighboring counties and has reduced water consumption by 30% while increasing yields. He turned to Montgomery. Chancellor, this is exactly the kind of innovation our new environmental complex aims to produce. Had I been consulted about her application, I would have strongly advocated for her admission. Our admissions department operates independently to ensure objectivity, Montgomery responded defensively. Yet it seems to consistently produce a student body remarkable for its homogeneity, William Mason observed. By your own published statistics, less than 3% of your students come from rural backgrounds. Less than 5% from families with incomes below the national median, despite your substantial endowment for financial aid. President Harlow, sensing the conversation slipping beyond recovery, attempted to pivot. Mr. Mason, your observations highlight areas where we can certainly improve. Perhaps this presents an opportunity for Mason Global to help shape a more inclusive approach to identifying and nurturing talent at Westridge? Mason's expression remained impassive. That's precisely what I'm evaluating today, Mr. President. Whether Westridge is genuinely open to examining its biases or simply interested in our endowment. He turned to his granddaughter. Olivia, would you share the project proposal you developed, the one Chancellor Montgomery declined to review during your meeting? Olivia opened her folder and distributed copies of a detailed research proposal. This is the watershed management system I've been developing over the past 3 years. It combines traditional farming knowledge about seasonal water patterns with cutting-edge sensor technology and predictive algorithms. As the academic leaders reviewed the document, their expressions shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement. The Dean of Environmental Sciences looked up first. This methodology bridges theoretical modeling with practical application in a way that's remarkably sophisticated. The scalability potential is tremendous. That's what Yale's environmental engineering department thought as well, Olivia replied without a trace of smugness. They've offered to fund the next phase of development as part of my undergraduate research. President Harlow looked up from the proposal, his expression grave. Mr. Mason, Olivia, it appears we've made a significant error in judgment, not just regarding this application, but perhaps in our entire approach to identifying potential in unexpected places. He turned to Montgomery. Chancellor, I believe we need to conduct a comprehensive review of our admissions criteria and processes. If we're overlooking this caliber of innovation because it comes in unfamiliar packaging, we're failing our institutional mission. Montgomery, sensing his position weakening by the minute, attempted one last defense. With respect, President Harlow, one case doesn't indicate a systemic issue. Our admissions process has produced classes of exceptional students who largely come from the same backgrounds, same schools, and same socioeconomic brackets, William Mason finished. Exceptional in their uniformity, perhaps, but hardly representative of the diversity of brilliance in our society. He stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. Mr. President, I appreciate your willingness to discuss these matters frankly. As I mentioned, Mason Global intends to establish a significant partnership with an institution that values innovation in all its forms. I'll be evaluating several universities in the coming weeks before making our decision. President Harlow rose quickly. Of course, and I hope you'll consider our conversation today as the beginning of a meaningful reassessment at Westridge, not merely damage control. We would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate how we can grow from this experience. Mason nodded politely. Actions will speak louder than words, Mr. President. I'll be watching with interest to see what changes Westridge implements, not just in its public statements, but in its actual practices. As the group prepared to leave, Olivia approached Chancellor Montgomery, who had remained seated, his usual confident demeanor noticeably diminished. Chancellor Montgomery, she said quietly, ensuring only he could hear her words, I didn't come here today seeking revenge or to embarrass you. I came because there are thousands of students like me, brilliant minds from backgrounds you've been trained not to value. They deserve consideration based on what they've achieved, not where they started. Montgomery looked up at her, seeing, for the first time, not a farm girl out of her depth, but a poised young woman with clarity of purpose he rarely encountered even among his most privileged students. Your rejection taught me something important, she continued. Excellence isn't defined by institutions like Westridge. It's defined by impact. My research will help farming communities survive climate change, whether or not it has your approval. But think of what Westridge is missing by filtering out voices like mine. With that, she turned and rejoined her grandfather, leaving Montgomery to contemplate how quickly his carefully ordered world had been upended, and by the very student he had so casually dismissed as unworthy of Westridge's rarefied environment. As the Masons and their team departed, the impressive jet taking off with the same precision with which it had arrived, President Harlow remained on the steps of the administration building with his leadership team. The students who had witnessed the drama had dispersed, but the ripple effects were already spreading across campus through social media and text messages. Richard, President Harlow said, using Montgomery's first name for the first time that day, I believe we have significant work ahead of us. This isn't just about one rejected student or one potential donor. This is about whether Westridge truly lives up to its stated mission of nurturing the brightest minds and most innovative thinkers of the next generation. Montgomery nodded slowly, the full implications of the day's events beginning to sink in. His entire professional identity had been built around being the gatekeeper of elite education, the arbiter of who belonged in the rarefied atmosphere of institutions like Westridge. Now, for the first time, he was being forced to consider whether the gates he'd been keeping had been excluding precisely the kind of innovative thinking the Academy claimed to champion. The weeks following William Mason's dramatic arrival at Westridge brought profound changes to the university. What had begun as an embarrassing confrontation quickly evolved into a fundamental reassessment of the institution's values and practices. For Chancellor Richard Montgomery, the transformation was both professional and personal, beginning with the most uncomfortable meeting of his career. 5 days after the private jet incident, Montgomery found himself sitting in President Harlow's office, surrounded by members of the university's Board of Trustees. The atmosphere was tense, the expressions around the polished conference table uniformly grave. Chancellor Montgomery, the president began, his normally diplomatic demeanor replaced by formal precision. Our preliminary review of the Mason case. as identified concerning patterns in our admissions practices. Of the 512 students admitted to next year's freshman class, only 9 come from rural communities, despite receiving applications from over 230 highly qualified rural students. Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in his tailored suit, acutely aware that his usual authoritative presence held no power in this room. Those results reflect objective evaluations, not deliberate exclusions, he insisted. Our holistic review process considers many factors beyond academics, which is precisely why we need to examine what those many factors actually are, interrupted Dr. Eleanor Trent, a senior board member and respected ethicist. When unstated, biases drive supposedly objective processes. We end up with homogeneous student bodies that reflect preference rather than potential. Montgomery nodded mechanically, understanding the precarious position he now occupied. The board could terminate his employment immediately, ending 2 decades of carefully constructed career advancement in a single afternoon. We're not here to determine your future with Westridge today, Chancellor, the president continued, as if reading his thoughts. We're here to address systemic issues in our admissions approach. The Mason incident has exposed blind spots that require immediate attention. What stung most wasn't the implied threat of discipline, but the realization that his professional reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was now tarnished. The exclusive excellence he had prioritized appeared hollow when measured against the genuine innovation and real-world impact someone like Olivia Mason represented. The incident has attracted significant media attention, noted the university's communications director, sliding a tablet across the table displaying several headlines. Elite university called out by tech billionaire. Are America's top schools missing rural genius? Mason Global CEO challenges ivory tower bias after granddaughter's rejection. Yale welcomes rural innovator, rejected by Westridge for cultivating soil. Mason Global Enterprises released a statement yesterday announcing their new $50 million endowment to Yale University for their Rural Innovation Fellows program, the director continued. Several major donors have contacted us with concerns about our commitment to true academic meritocracy. As the meeting concluded, President Harlow remained behind, fixing Montgomery with a searching gaze. Richard, we've worked together for 12 years. I've always valued your commitment to excellence, but I'm struggling to understand how someone with Olivia Mason's credentials was dismissed so categorically. Montgomery managed a tight nod. I made assumptions based on her background that I now recognize were unfounded. It goes deeper than that, Harlow replied. Our institutional values statement claims we seek diverse perspectives and innovative thinking, yet our admissions practices seem designed to produce students who think and look remarkably alike. He paused. The board has approved a comprehensive review of our admissions criteria, to be led by an external consultant with expertise in educational access and equity. The comment stayed with Montgomery as he walked back to his office, the familiar campus, suddenly appearing different through newly critical eyes. For the first time in his career, he really looked at the student body he had helped create, not assessing their prestige value, but seeing the homogeneity that had become Westridge's defining characteristic despite its claims of valuing diversity. The following morning, Montgomery made a decision. Instead of delegating the preliminary data gathering for the admissions review, he pulled the files himself, beginning with rejected applicants who had exceptional academic credentials, but came from backgrounds unlike those traditionally represented at Westridge. What he discovered was disturbing. The pattern went far beyond Olivia Mason. Dozens of brilliant students from rural communities, inner-city schools, or working-class backgrounds had been rejected despite academic achievements that equaled or surpassed many admitted students from more privileged backgrounds. Sitting amid the growing stacks of files in his office after hours, Montgomery confronted an uncomfortable truth. He had been the architect of a system that confused privilege with potential, that valued polished presentation over genuine substance, that mistook familiarity for excellence. A knock at his open door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Professor Williams from the Environmental Sciences Department standing in the doorway. "Working late, Chancellor?" he asked, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Reviewing some admissions data," Montgomery replied, gesturing to the files surrounding him. "You were right about Olivia Mason. Her research was exceptional. I should have recognized that." Williams entered and took a seat across from his desk. "May I speak frankly?" Montgomery nodded, too exhausted for the usual administrative facades. "Westridge has incredible resources and tremendous potential," Williams said, "but we've developed blind spots that limit what we could become. For years, those of us in applied sciences have watched as theoretical work received preferential funding and recognition, while practical innovation was subtly dismissed as less intellectually rigorous. Like environmental adaptation research," Montgomery acknowledged. "Exactly. We've created artificial hierarchies of knowledge, placing abstract theory above practical application, urban perspectives above rural ones, traditional academic pathways above innovative ones." He leaned forward. "The irony is that the most groundbreaking work often happens at the intersection of these different approaches." Montgomery considered this. "Like Olivia Mason's research combining theoretical models with practical field testing." "Precisely. The next generation of innovation will come from people who can bridge different worlds, academic rigor with real-world application, traditional knowledge with cutting-edge technology." Williams gestured toward the files. "And we've been systematically excluding many of those potential bridge builders because they don't fit our narrow image of what a Westridge student should be." The conversation continued for over an hour, evolving from critique to constructive ideas for reform. By the time Professor Williams left his office, something fundamental had shifted in Montgomery's perspective. Excellence was no longer a narrow path defined by traditional markers of prestige, but a diverse landscape of possibilities he had previously failed to recognize. Over the following months, Westridge's admissions office underwent a profound transformation. Working with the external consultants, Montgomery led a complete restructuring of the evaluation process. Anonymous application reviews removed name and background information that might trigger bias. Evaluation criteria were expanded to recognize different forms of excellence that had previously been overlooked or undervalued. Most significantly, the admissions team itself was diversified to include perspectives that could recognize potential in unfamiliar forms. Initially, some traditional donors and alumni expressed concern about lowering standards, but these objections faded as early results demonstrated that the new approach was actually raising the bar for genuine academic excellence while simultaneously broadening access. Students admitted under the reformed criteria brought fresh perspectives and approaches that energized classroom discussions and research projects. One particularly promising freshman from Appalachia had developed a low-cost water filtration system for communities affected by mining contamination. Another from South Texas had created an innovative community health education program that had reduced diabetes rates in her county by 25%. 6 months after William Mason's private jet had disrupted the campus, Westridge hosted an educational innovation conference focusing on bridging academic theory with practical application. Speakers included leaders from environmental science, urban development, public health and technology, fields where real-world impact depended on translating theoretical knowledge into practical solutions. In the university's Grand Hall, Chancellor Montgomery found himself introducing a panel on recognizing excellence beyond traditional metrics. As he surveyed the diverse audience of educators, researchers, and industry leaders, he reflected on how dramatically his own metrics had evolved. 6 months ago, he began with unusual candor, I would have defined excellence through a narrow set of traditional achievements. Today, Westridge is learning to recognize that true innovation often emerges from unexpected sources and unconventional pathways. The audience included both President Harlow and Professor Williams, who nodded in appreciation of his public acknowledgement of the institution's ongoing transformation. Also present, somewhat surprisingly, were William Mason and his granddaughter, Olivia, who had accepted Westridge's invitation to participate in a panel on environmental innovation. After the formal sessions concluded, Montgomery approached the Masons during the reception. The moment was uncomfortable, but necessary. Mr. Mason, Olivia, he began, I want to thank you for accepting our invitation despite our previous interaction. Your presence adds tremendous value to this conversation. Mason nodded politely, his expression reserved, but not hostile. Westridge's efforts to reform its approach are commendable. When President Harlow reached out personally to explain the changes being implemented, we felt it was worth engaging with that process. Turning to Olivia, Montgomery continued with genuine humility. I owe you a particular apology, Olivia. My dismissal of your achievements and background reflected biases I hadn't recognized in myself. Your research deserved serious consideration regardless of where it was conducted. Olivia studied him thoughtfully. Thank you for saying that, Chancellor Montgomery. I'm genuinely impressed by Westridge's willingness to examine its practices. So thoroughly. She paused. Change is rarely comfortable, especially when it requires questioning assumptions that have guided an entire career. Are you finding Yale's program a good fit for your work? Montgomery asked, remembering that Yale and Princeton had both accepted her. Very much so, Olivia replied. Their approach to environmental innovation combines rigorous theory with practical application, which aligns perfectly with my interests, but I'm also collaborating with students here at Westridge through Professor Williams' new cross-institutional research initiative. This was news to Montgomery. Cross-institutional research? Yes, William Mason explained. While our primary endowment went to Yale, we've established a smaller grant for collaborative research between Westridge, Yale, Princeton, and several land-grant universities. Professor Williams is coordinating Westridge's participation. President Harlow joined their conversation, adding, the initiative is already yielding impressive results. Students from different institutional cultures bringing complementary perspectives to complex environmental challenges. The Water Conservation Project has attracted interest from 3 international development organizations. As they continued, discussing the emerging collaboration, Montgomery recognized the elegant solution the Masons had crafted, not excluding Westridge entirely, but creating a structure that required the university to engage with institutions and approaches it had previously dismissed. It was both a generous second chance and a subtle mechanism for ensuring continued reform. Later that evening, as the conference reception wound down, Montgomery found himself standing alone with President Harlow, watching as faculty and visitors engaged in animated conversations across the hall. Different energy than our usual events, he observed. Harlow nodded. More dynamic, more diverse perspectives. The conversations have substance beyond networking and prestige signaling. He turned to Montgomery directly. You've handled this transition admirably, Richard. Many in your position would have resisted or resigned. I considered it, Montgomery admitted, but that would have been running from a problem I helped create. The truth is, I'm finding this new approach to identifying and nurturing excellence far more interesting than our previous model. As are our faculty and students, Harlow replied. Applications for next year are up 27%, with significant increases from demographics we've historically underrepresented. And counter to some fears, our academic metrics are strengthening, not weakening. Across the room, Olivia Mason was engaged in animated conversation with several Westridge students and faculty, her passion for environmental innovation evident in her gestures and expression. Watching her, Montgomery felt a complex mixture of regret for his earlier dismissal and appreciation for the institutional transformation that dismissal had ultimately triggered. She would have contributed so much to our community, Montgomery said quietly. She still is, Harlow pointed out, just not in the way either of us would have predicted. Sometimes our greatest impact comes from challenging systems rather than joining them. As the evening concluded, Montgomery reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The administrator, who had once dismissed rural environmental expertise as inherently less valuable than traditional academic credentials, now recognized that innovation thrived at the intersection of different knowledge systems. His definition of excellence had expanded beyond recognition, incorporating forms of achievement and potential he had previously been blind to. It had all begun with a moment of humiliation on the campus green, a private jet and his own willingness to grow beyond limitations toward a more comprehensive understanding of what excellence truly meant. A lesson more valuable than any he had learned in his decades in academic administration. 5 years later, the Westridge Center for Inclusive Excellence opened its doors on a perfect autumn morning, with maple trees blazing red and gold across the transformed campus. The renovated Georgian building that once housed the exclusive Founders Club now served as the home for programs designed to identify and nurture talent from underrepresented backgrounds. Its stately columns and historic facade remained, but inside, modern collaborative spaces and advanced technology created an environment where innovation flourished. Outside, a diverse crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony, students whose backgrounds spanned rural communities to urban centers, faculty members who had embraced the institutional transformation, alumni who had initially resisted change but now championed it, and educational leaders from across the country who had come to study what many now called the Westridge model. President Harlow, now in his final year before retirement, approached the podium set up on the building's wide steps. At 67, his distinguished appearance had only been enhanced by the silver that now dominated his once dark hair and the wisdom gained through navigating institutional change. Welcome everyone to what I believe represents not just Westridge's future, but a new vision for higher education in America. He began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. 5 years ago, our institution faced a moment of reckoning, when our stated values of excellence and innovation were revealed to be far narrower in practice than in principle. In the front row, Chancellor Richard Montgomery sat with quiet composure. At 63, he had transformed from a guardian of tradition to one of the most respected voices in educational access reform, his journey from exclusivity to inclusivity having become a case study in leadership adaptation. Beside him sat Professor Williams, now the acclaimed director of Westridge's thriving Environmental Innovation Institute, which had become a national model for connecting academic research with practical application. Today, President Harlow continued, the Center for Inclusive Excellence stands as testament to what happens when an institution has the courage to examine its biases, the wisdom to recognize overlooked forms of potential, and the commitment to build systems that truly serve our educational mission rather than merely perpetuating privilege. The journey from crisis to transformation had not been simple or linear. After the initial reforms to Westridge's admissions practices, deeper systemic issues had emerged throughout the institution. Academic departments had confronted implicit hierarchies that privileged certain forms of knowledge over others. Financial aid systems that inadvertently favored students from wealthy backgrounds had been restructured. Faculty hiring practices had been reformed to recognize excellence in diverse forms rather than through narrow traditional pathways. President Harlow gestured toward Montgomery and the leadership team seated in the front row. "I want to acknowledge the courage it takes to lead change from within, to recognize when long-held assumptions no longer serve our highest purpose, and to rebuild systems with greater integrity and vision." Westridge's transformation began with a confrontation that could have ended with defensiveness and denial. Instead, it became a catalyst for institutional renewal. The crowd applauded as Montgomery nodded in acknowledgement, his former embarrassment having transformed into a kind of quiet pride in the difficult journey Westridge had undertaken. The university's commitment to genuine excellence had not diminished. In fact, by most academic metrics, it had strengthened considerably. What had changed was how that excellence was identified, nurtured, and expressed. After Westridge's initial reforms to its admissions criteria, other elite institutions had watched with skepticism, predicting a decline in academic standards and reputational standing. But as the university's research output increased, student achievements multiplied, and postgraduate outcomes improved across all measures, that skepticism had gradually transformed into interest. What began as one institution's crisis response had evolved into a movement that was changing how excellence was defined throughout higher education. The inclusive excellence framework we celebrate today, President Harlow explained, recognizes that innovation thrives at the intersection of different perspectives, that academic rigor is strengthened rather than diminished by diverse approaches to knowledge, and that institutions truly committed to excellence must continually examine who they include and exclude from opportunity. As part of the ceremony, the university unveiled its newly established Olivia Mason Fellows program, designed to identify brilliant students from rural communities whose innovative approaches to environmental and agricultural challenges represented the kind of bridge building between theory and application that had become Westridge's hallmark. And in a moment that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier, Olivia Mason herself, now Dr. Olivia Mason, having completed her PhD at Yale, with groundbreaking research in sustainable water management, stepped to the podium as the program's honorary first fellow. "When I was rejected by Westridge 5 years ago," she began with characteristic directness, "it wasn't just a personal disappointment, but a symptom of how higher education often fails to recognize innovation that comes in unfamiliar forms or from unexpected places." The audience, including many who had been part of that original admission system, listened with remarkable openness to her candid assessment. What Westridge has accomplished since then isn't merely about correcting a mistaken rejection or becoming more diverse for diversity's sake, she continued. It's about recognizing that excellence takes many forms, that innovation often happens at the boundaries between different worlds, and that the most pressing challenges facing humanity require collaboration across traditional divides. After the formal dedication ceremony, as attendees explored the new center, Montgomery found himself approached by a young woman in her first year at Westridge, a student from a small farming community in Nebraska who had been admitted through the reformed admissions process. "Chancellor Montgomery," the student began somewhat nervously, "I wanted to thank you personally. My high school counselor told me not to bother applying to Westridge, that they never accepted students like me. But then she attended one of your outreach workshops and changed her mind." Montgomery smiled, remembering the extensive work his team had done to reach counselors in rural and underserved communities. "What's your field of study?" "Renewable energy engineering with a focus on agricultural applications," the student replied, her confidence growing as she spoke about her passion. "I've been working with biofuel systems on my family's farm since I was 14, and I've developed some modifications that improve efficiency by nearly 40%. Professor Williams is helping me formalize the research so we can publish it." Listening to the student's enthusiastic explanation of her innovations, Montgomery was struck by how similar she sounded to Olivia Mason 5 years earlier, and how differently Westridge now responded to such talent. Where once the institution might have dismissed practical innovation as less valuable than theoretical work, it now recognized the powerful potential in students who bridged different worlds. Later that afternoon, at the reception following the dedication, Montgomery found himself standing with William Mason, who had returned to campus for the first time since his dramatic arrival with the private jet. Now in his late 70s, Mason had become an even more influential figure in environmental innovation, his company's technologies helping communities worldwide adapt to changing climate conditions. "Quite a transformation," he observed, gesturing toward the diverse gathering of students, faculty, and visitors engaged in animated conversations throughout the reception hall. "Not just in demographics, but in energy and purpose." Montgomery nodded. "The changes went far deeper than I initially imagined possible. What began as reforms to our admissions process ultimately led us to re-examine every aspect of how we define and nurture excellence, and strengthened your institution in the process," Mason noted. "Westridge's research output in sustainable technologies has increased dramatically. Several of our recent innovations at Mason Global began as collaborative projects with your faculty and students." This was true. After the initial confrontation, Mason Global had indeed directed its major endowment to Yale. But over time, as Westridge demonstrated genuine commitment to reform, the company had gradually increased its engagement with the university. What began as a small grant for cross-institutional research had evolved into significant research partnerships that benefited both the institution and the company. Your arrival with that private jet could have been the beginning of the end for my career, Montgomery acknowledged with surprising candor. "Instead, it became the catalyst for the most meaningful work I've done in education." Mason studied him thoughtfully. Institutional change rarely happens without some form of disruption. What matters is how leadership responds to that disruption, with defensiveness or with growth. As the celebration continued into the evening, Montgomery observed a moment that perfectly encapsulated Westridge's transformation. In one corner of the reception hall, Dr. Olivia Mason was engaged in animated conversation with the university's most recent Rhodes Scholar, a young woman from rural Maine whose research combining traditional ecological knowledge with cutting-edge data analysis had earned international recognition. They were joined by 3 current students, 2 faculty members, and a visiting researcher from Mason Global, all focused intently on solving a complex problem related to water purification in drought conditions. What struck Montgomery most was the complete absence of hierarchy in their interaction. The Rhodes Scholar listened with genuine interest, as a first-year student explained her observations from her family's community. Olivia built on those insights with data from her Yale research. The faculty members offered theoretical frameworks that might explain the patterns they were discussing. The Mason Global researcher contributed practical considerations about implementation at scale, This was Westridge's new definition of excellence in action, collaborative rather than competitive, valuing diverse forms of knowledge, connecting theory with application, and recognizing that innovation thrives at the intersection of different perspectives. As the event concluded, President Harlow joined Montgomery as he prepared to leave. "I've been meaning to tell you," he said, "the board has unanimously approved your appointment as my successor when I retire next year. They believe your leadership of our transformation makes you uniquely qualified to guide Westridge's next chapter." The news was both surprising and deeply affirming. "I'm honored by their confidence," Montgomery replied, genuinely moved, "though I can't help but appreciate the irony given how close I came to resigning in disgrace 5 years ago." "The best leaders aren't those who never make mistakes," Harlow observed. "They're those who have the courage to learn from them and the vision to build something better as a result." 10 years later, the National Conference on Inclusive Excellence in Higher Education buzzed with energy as educational leaders from across the globe gathered to exchange ideas about transforming institutional cultures and practices. The grand ballroom of the Washington Convention Center was filled to capacity for the keynote address, a presentation on what had become known as the Westridge Revolution and its ripple effects throughout American education. At the podium stood Dr. Richard Montgomery, now in his final year as president of Westridge Academy and recently named the incoming chair of the American Council on Education. At 73, his presence carried the gravitas of someone who had not only led institutional transformation, but had become its most compelling advocate across the higher education landscape. 10 years ago, he began, his voice carrying confidently. Through the packed hall, a private jet piloted by a grandfather defending his granddaughter's dignity forced my institution to confront an uncomfortable truth: that our definition of excellence was not only narrow, but fundamentally flawed, confusing privilege with potential and familiarity with quality. In the front row sat Dr. Olivia Mason, now 38 and a rising star in sustainable water technology. After completing her Yale doctorate, she had established the Rural Innovation Network, connecting brilliant young innovators from agricultural communities with research institutions and technology companies. Beside her sat her grandfather, William Mason, whose dramatic intervention a decade earlier had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond one university or one rejected student. "What began as a crisis for Westridge," President Montgomery continued, "evolved into a movement that has transformed how we think about merit, potential, and the very purpose of higher education. Today, over 300 institutions have implemented some version of what began as the Westridge model, and the results speak for themselves." The screen behind him displayed compelling data. Research output across participating institutions had increased by an average of 35%. Patent applications had risen by 43%. Most significantly, graduates from these institutions were demonstrating exceptional success in addressing complex real-world challenges, from climate adaptation to healthcare access to sustainable food systems. "The evidence is clear," Montgomery noted, gesturing toward the data. "When institutions expand their definition of excellence beyond traditional markers of privilege, when they recognize brilliance in its many forms, they don't sacrifice quality, they enhance it dramatically." The journey from Westridge's transformation to broader educational reform had not been straightforward. After the initial success of their institutional changes, Montgomery and his team had been invited to share their approach at regional educational conferences. What began as presentations about admissions reform gradually expanded into comprehensive workshops on recognizing and nurturing diverse forms of excellence throughout academic institutions. Initially, other elite universities had maintained a skeptical distance, viewing Westridge's approach as a potential dilution of standards. But as the data on student outcomes, research innovation, and postgraduate success accumulated, skepticism had gradually given way to curiosity and eventually to emulation. The most powerful evidence for this approach, Montgomery explained, to the assembled educators comes not just from institutional metrics, but from the kinds of solutions our graduates are generating for complex global challenges. When we bring together students with diverse perspectives, knowledge systems, and life experiences, they develop approaches that simply wouldn't emerge from homogeneous groups with similar backgrounds. He clicked to the next slide, which showcased several groundbreaking innovations that had emerged from Westridge's transformed academic environment. A water conservation system developed by a team led by a student from a drought-prone farming region. A community healthcare delivery model created by students who had experienced rural medical access challenges firsthand. A sustainable housing design that combined cutting-edge materials science with traditional building practices from various cultures. These innovations share a common feature, Montgomery noted. They all emerged from teams that included students who would have been rejected by our previous admission system, not because they lacked brilliance, but because their brilliance came in forms we had been trained not to recognize. After the keynote address, the conference broke into specialized sessions, including one led by Dr. Olivia Mason on rural innovation as a catalyst for technological advancement. Her session attracted education leaders alongside representatives from major technology companies and research institutions who had come to understand the competitive advantage of engaging with knowledge systems previously marginalized in academic settings. The most significant innovations in environmental technology over the past decade, Mason explained to her packed session, have emerged at the intersection of advanced data science and generations of practical ecological knowledge. When we bridge these worlds instead of privileging one over the other, we develop solutions that are both theoretically sound and practically implementable. Her approach had not just influenced educational institutions, but had transformed how major environmental technology companies identified and developed talent. Mason Global had established the Rural Innovation Talent Pipeline, recruiting brilliant young people from farming communities who demonstrated exceptional problem-solving abilities regardless of their traditional academic credentials. Other companies had followed suit, recognizing that conventional recruiting focused almost exclusively on prestigious institutions had caused them to miss extraordinary talent from underrepresented backgrounds. In another conference room, a panel discussion on redefining merit in selective institutions featured admissions directors from several elite universities that had followed Westridge's lead in reforming their evaluation processes. The conversation focused not on lowering standards, but on developing more sophisticated and accurate methods for identifying potential excellence in diverse forms. The traditional markers we relied on, standardized tests, AP courses, extracurricular activities available primarily at wealthy schools, were never truly meritocratic, explained the admissions director from a prestigious West Coast university. They measured privilege and access as much as ability and potential. The Westridge model has given us tools to see past those limitations, to identify genuine brilliance wherever it exists. During the conference luncheon, President Montgomery found himself seated with education leaders from rural states who had seen dramatic changes in how their students were perceived by elite institutions. Before Westridge started this movement, noted a superintendent from Idaho, I had brilliant students who didn't even bother applying to selective universities because they assumed, usually correctly, that their rural background would count against them, regardless of their achievements. Now those same students are being actively recruited by those institutions, which recognize the unique perspectives they bring. Similar stories echoed around the table. accounts of students whose exceptional talents had previously been overlooked or dismissed because they didn't fit traditional profiles of elite college material. As admissions practices had evolved, these students were increasingly finding their way to institutions where they could develop their abilities at the highest levels. As the conference continued into its second day, attendees toured the newly established National Center for Inclusive Excellence, a research and advocacy organization dedicated to expanding educational access and redefining merit across all levels of education. The center's main hall featured interactive displays showcasing the data behind the transformation movement, demonstrating how expanding access had strengthened rather than weakened institutional outcomes across all conventional metrics. President Montgomery paused before a display that tracked the 10-year journey from Westridge's crisis to national movement. The timeline began with a photograph captured by a student's phone that day on the campus green. William Mason standing beside his gleaming private jet, confronting a visibly flustered Chancellor Montgomery about his dismissal of his granddaughters. Achievements. That should have been the most humiliating moment of my professional life, Montgomery commented to a colleague who had joined him. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most meaningful work I've ever done. That's the power of how you responded, his colleague observed. You could have become defensive or resigned. Instead, you chose to learn and grow. I had help, Montgomery acknowledged. William and Olivia Mason could have simply exposed our biases and walked away. Instead, they remained engaged, challenging us while also providing pathways for meaningful change. Later that evening, at the conference's gala dinner, President Montgomery received the inaugural Transformational Leadership Award for his role in sparking nationwide educational reform. As he accepted the honor, he reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past decade. This award recognizes not just one person or one institution, he told the assembled educators, but a movement that has fundamentally challenged how we define excellence, merit, and potential in education. What began with a confrontation over a rejected student has evolved into a reimagining of what education at its best can and should be. He held up the award, a crystal sculpture depicting diverse paths converging toward a common summit. I accept this honor with the humility of someone who began this journey as part of the problem, not the solution. My greatest contribution was simply having the courage to question assumptions I had long taken for granted, to recognize excellence in forms I'd been trained not to see. The applause that followed reflected not just appreciation for Montgomery's remarks, but recognition of the broader transformation they represented, how institutions could evolve when leaders remained open to growth and learning. After the ceremony, President Montgomery invited William and Dr. Olivia Mason to join him on the convention center's terrace, which offered a sweeping view of the capital city. As they looked out over the illuminated monuments, he handed them small boxes wrapped in Westridge's colors. "The board wanted you both to have these," he explained. "They're being awarded at commencement next month." The Masons opened the boxes to find honorary doctorate certificates from Westridge Academy, William in technological innovation and Olivia in environmental leadership. "I'm not sure what to say," William remarked, genuinely moved by the gesture. "When I landed that jet on your athletic field 10 years ago, I wasn't thinking about transforming education. I was just standing up for my granddaughter's dignity." Sometimes, the most profound changes begin with the simplest human motivations, Montgomery replied. "I've often wondered how differently things might have unfolded if I had simply taken the time to really see Olivia's achievements during that first meeting." "Then this movement might never have started," Olivia observed. "Sometimes systems need disruption before they can evolve." As they returned to the gala, They passed an exhibit showcasing the impact of reformed admissions practices across diverse student populations. First-generation college students, rural innovators, urban problem solvers, and others whose brilliance had previously been overlooked by traditional metrics. One display particularly caught their attention, a comparative analysis showing how research teams with diverse backgrounds and perspectives consistently generated more innovative and effective solutions to complex problems than homogeneous teams with similar training. The research provided scientific validation for what their experience had already demonstrated, that excellence thrives in environments where different knowledge systems and perspectives can engage productively. That's the real legacy, Olivia noted, studying the display. Not just more equitable access, but better outcomes for everyone. When institutions recognize excellence in all its forms, they don't just benefit the previously excluded, they enhance their ability to fulfill their core mission. 25 years later, the sun cast long shadows across Westridge Academy's campus as people gathered for the dedication of the Mason Center for Rural Innovation. The striking modern building, with its sustainable design, incorporating both cutting-edge technology and traditional agricultural architecture elements, stood as the newest addition to a campus that had been transformed not just physically, but philosophically over the past quarter century. An elderly man in his late 80s moved slowly toward the podium. His steps measured, but his eyes still bright with the intelligence and vision that had defined his career. Dr. Richard Montgomery, President Emeritus of Westridge and former chair of the American Council on Education, smiled as he surveyed the crowd, a diverse gathering that would have been unimaginable during his early years as Chancellor of Admissions. 25 years ago, on this very ground, he began, his voice still carrying surprising strength, a private jet landed and disrupted our carefully cultivated campus atmosphere and challenged assumptions that had gone unquestioned for generations. What could have been merely an embarrassing incident instead became the catalyst for the most profound transformation in American higher education in a century. The audience included current Westridge students and faculty, educational leaders from across the country, and dozens of graduates of what had become known as the Mason Scholars Program. Brilliant innovators from rural backgrounds whose work was transforming environmental science, technology, agricultural systems, and public policy worldwide. At the center of the front row sat Dr. Olivia Mason, now 53 and internationally renowned for her work in sustainable water systems. As the founder of the Global Rural Innovation Network and recipient of the World Environmental Prize, she had become one of Westridge's most celebrated associates, despite never having been its student. Beside her sat several generations of her family, including her elderly grandfather, William Mason, now in his late 90s, who had piloted the private jet in that fateful confrontation 25 years earlier. The building we dedicate today, Dr. Montgomery continued, represents not just a physical space, but a philosophy that has reshaped how we recognize and nurture human potential. The Mason Center will serve as both an educational facility and a global hub connecting rural innovators worldwide with the resources, mentorship, and institutional support their brilliance deserves. The journey from confrontation to collaboration had continued to evolve over the decades. What began as Westridge's internal reforms had expanded into a national movement and eventually into a global network dedicated to recognizing excellence in all its diverse manifestations. The once elite university that had rejected a brilliant farm girl had transformed into a world leader in identifying and developing talent from previously overlooked backgrounds and communities. When I reflect on the changes of the past 25 years, Montgomery acknowledged, I'm reminded of how often transformation begins with discomfort, with moments that challenge our certainties and force us to reconsider deeply held assumptions. The private jet that landed on this spot represented not just a grandfather's defense of his granddaughter's dignity, but a fundamental challenge to how we defined excellence, merit, and potential. The audience included many who had been skeptical of, or even opposed to, Westridge's initial reforms. Several trustees who had initially feared lowering standards now served as the institution's most vocal advocates for inclusive excellence, having seen how expanding their definition of merit had dramatically strengthened, rather than weakened, the university's academic standing and impact. After Dr. Montgomery's opening remarks, the current Westridge president, Dr. Maya Johnson, herself, a first-generation college graduate from a small farming community in Georgia, approached the podium. At 45, she represented the generational shift that had occurred as institutions increasingly recognized leadership potential in those with non-traditional backgrounds. The Mason Center we dedicate today, President Johnson explained, will house our expanding rural innovation programs, connecting brilliant young people from agricultural communities worldwide with the resources, mentorship, and technological tools to address humanity's most pressing challenges. The center includes research facilities, collaborative spaces, and global communication technologies that will allow rural innovators to engage with each other and with research institutions across traditional boundaries. The architectural design of the center reflected its mission, a harmonious blend of traditional barn timber framing with cutting-edge, sustainable materials and technology. Solar panels that doubled as crop protection covers in the adjacent teaching fields powered the facility, while water reclamation systems demonstrated the integrated approach to resource management that had become a hallmark of the Mason approach to innovation. When it came time for Dr. Olivia Mason to speak, she was accompanied to the podium by her eldest daughter, who was now completing her doctorate at Westridge in climate adaptation systems. At 53, Mason carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone whose work had transformed not just institutions, but lives around the world. When I was rejected by Westridge 25 years ago, she began with the directness that had become her trademark. It represented more than personal disappointment. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about where innovation comes from and how excellence manifests in diverse forms. She gestured toward the crowd of Mason scholars, hundreds of graduates from rural backgrounds whose brilliance had been recognized and nurtured through the program established in her name. These remarkable individuals represent what happens when institutions look beyond traditional markers of achievement to recognize potential wherever it exists. Their work in sustainable agriculture, climate adaptation, rural healthcare, and technological innovation is addressing challenges that can only be solved by bringing different knowledge systems together. The Mason Scholars Program, established 15 years earlier, through a major endowment from Mason Global Enterprises, had become one of the most prestigious and competitive fellowships in higher education. Unlike traditional scholarship programs that relied primarily on standardized metrics, the selection process incorporated innovative assessment approaches designed to identify exceptional problem-solving abilities, creativity, and practical innovation. Skills that might not be captured by conventional academic measures. The building that bears my family's name, Olivia continued, represents a philosophy rather than a tribute. The understanding that brilliance exists in every community and context, that innovation often emerges from the intersection of different knowledge systems, and that institutions truly committed to excellence must continually expand their vision of where and how that excellence might appear. After the formal speeches, as attendees explored the new facility, Dr. Montgomery found A quiet moment with William Mason, who had watched the proceedings with evident emotion. Now in his late 90s, he moved with the assistance of a wheelchair, but retained the sharp intelligence and quiet dignity that had characterized his confrontation with Westridge's administration a quarter-century earlier. "Did you ever imagine this?" Montgomery asked, gesturing toward the center and the diverse gathering of students, faculty, and innovators flowing through its spaces. Mason smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Not specifically, no. When I landed that jet on your campus, I wasn't thinking about institutional transformation or educational philosophy. I was simply defending my granddaughter's dignity and challenging the arbitrary barriers placed in her path. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest human impulses," Montgomery observed. "Your willingness to disrupt the status quo created space for questions that needed to be asked. And your willingness to engage with those questions, rather than becoming defensive, created the possibility for genuine transformation," Mason replied. "Many in your position would have simply dismissed us as troublemakers and carried on as before." They were joined by Olivia, who had been speaking with a group of current Mason scholars, young innovators from farming communities across the globe whose potential had been recognized through the expanded metrics Westridge had pioneered. The first cohort of global Mason scholars is already making remarkable progress, she reported. The young woman from Tanzania has developed an integrated water harvesting system that's increased agricultural yields by 45% while reducing consumption. The brother and sister team from Montana have created a drought-resistant wheat variety that maintains production even in extreme conditions. What struck Montgomery most as he listened to these accounts was how completely Westridge's definition of excellence had transformed. The institution that had once measured its success through exclusivity, proudly rejecting over 95% of applicants, now celebrated its ability to identify and nurture brilliant young people who would never have been considered under its former metrics. As part of the day's events, a special exhibition had been mounted in the center's main hall, documenting the 25-year journey from confrontation to collaboration. The centerpiece was the original photograph captured by a student's phone, William Mason, standing beside his impressive private jet, confronting then-Chancellor Montgomery about his dismissal of his granddaughter's achievements. Beside this image was a timeline showing the evolution of Westridge's policies and practices, alongside data demonstrating how these changes had strengthened rather than weakened the institution. Research output had increased by over 250%. Patents and innovations emerging from Westridge had quintupled. Most significantly, graduates were demonstrating exceptional impact in addressing complex global challenges from climate change to food security to sustainable development. "The data is undeniable," noted the current Dean of Admissions, who had joined the group as they viewed the exhibition. "When we expanded our definition of excellence and developed more sophisticated tools to identify potential in its many forms, we didn't lower our standards. We raised them by recognizing brilliance we had previously missed." As the day's festivities continued into evening, a special ceremony honored the original Mason scholar, the first rural student admitted under Westridge's reformed admissions criteria 25 years earlier. Now a distinguished professor of environmental engineering, she had developed water conservation technologies that were being implemented in drought-prone regions worldwide. "When Chancellor Montgomery called to tell me I'd been accepted to Westridge, I thought it was a prank," the professor recalled to appreciative laughter. "My high school counselor had told me not to bother applying to elite universities because they weren't for people like us. Now my own daughter is a sophomore here studying agricultural economics alongside students from every conceivable background." As night fell over the campus, the Mason Center was illuminated from within. its innovative design creating a pattern of light that resembled stars scattered across a rural night sky. The gathered community moved outside for a final ceremony, the illumination of a simple sculpture installed at the exact spot where William Mason's jet had landed 25 years earlier. The sculpture, titled Convergence, represented two different paths coming together: traditional agricultural knowledge and advanced scientific research joining to create something stronger than either alone. As lights activated at its base, President Johnson invited Dr. Montgomery, William Mason, and Dr. Olivia Mason to stand together beside the artwork. 25 years ago, these three individuals stood on this spot as adversaries, she noted. Today, they stand as collaborators whose willingness to move beyond confrontation toward mutual understanding has transformed not just Westridge, but educational institutions worldwide. The three figures, the former administrator who had defended a flawed system, the grandfather who had challenged it, and the granddaughter whose brilliance had been initially dismissed, stood together as living embodiment of how conflict, when approached with openness rather than defensiveness, could yield transformation rather than mere opposition. As the celebration concluded, Dr. Montgomery found himself standing alone with William and Olivia Mason, the evening crowd having dispersed to various receptions and events throughout the new center. "I've been thinking about that moment in my office when I dismissed your research," Montgomery admitted to Olivia. "Do you remember what I said?" "We cultivate intellectual sophistication, not soil and crops," Olivia quoted with a smile that held no bitterness, words that have become rather famous in educational circles. "The great irony," Montgomery reflected, "is that your work cultivating drought-resistant crops has saved more lives and done more good than all the theoretical papers I thought represented true intellectual sophistication. You were cultivating both crops and intellectual sophistication, while I couldn't see beyond my narrow definitions of what counted as valuable knowledge." William Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Educational institutions have tremendous power to either validate or dismiss different forms of knowledge and achievement. The real transformation of the past 25 years hasn't been about who gets admitted to elite universities. It's been about expanding our understanding of what constitutes excellence and where innovation can emerge." As they looked out over the campus, where students from farming communities now studied alongside those from urban centers and suburbs, from wealthy families and modest backgrounds, from traditional academic pathways and unconventional routes to achievement, they witnessed the living legacy of their unlikely collaboration. What had begun as a moment of confrontation, a grandfather defending his granddaughter's dignity against institutional dismissal, had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond one student or one university. The private jet that had once seemed like an embarrassing disruption to Westridge's carefully cultivated image had become a powerful symbol in educational circles, a reminder that excellence manifests in many forms and that institutions must continually expand their vision to recognize brilliance wherever it appears. The Mason Center for Rural Innovation stood as a physical embodiment of this philosophy, not just a building, but a bridge between worlds that had once seemed separate. Theoretical and practical knowledge, academic tradition and real-world innovation, privileged institutions and rural communities. Its mission extended beyond education in the traditional sense to the broader purpose of connecting human potential with the resources needed to address humanity's most pressing challenges. And it had all begun with three words: not soil and crops, spoken dismissively in an admissions office 25 years earlier. Words that had sparked a confrontation that could have ended with bitterness and recrimination, but instead had yielded growth, collaboration and transformation that continued to expand with each passing year, changing not just who had access to educational opportunity, but how excellence itself was understood and nurtured in a complex and interconnected world. The following morning, as the commemorative events continued, the campus awakened to an unexpected sight. On the same athletic field where William Mason's jet had landed 25 years before, a formation of drones hovered in the early morning light, creating patterns that shifted and evolved as students and faculty gathered to watch. These weren't ordinary drones, but the latest generation of Mason Agrotech environmental monitoring systems, autonomous devices that combined cutting-edge sensor technology with artificial intelligence to help farmers optimize water usage, detect plant diseases before they spread, and dramatically reduce the need for chemical interventions. Leading the demonstration was Dr. Emma Chen, Olivia Mason's former research assistant, who had become Mason Global's Chief Environmental Technology Officer. Using a tablet, she guided the formation through increasingly complex maneuvers, demonstrating how the systems could map water resources, soil composition, and crop health with unprecedented precision. These systems, she explained to the gathering, were initially conceptualized in Olivia's doctoral research at Yale, the same research that Westridge once dismissed as mere farming techniques. Today, they're helping farmers in 47 countries adapt to changing climate conditions while significantly reducing their environmental footprint. What made the demonstration particularly meaningful was the fact that several of the young engineers who had helped design the latest generation of the technology were current Mason scholars at Westridge, students from rural backgrounds who were combining their practical knowledge of agricultural challenges with advanced engineering skills. One of them, a sophomore from a small farming community in California, stepped forward to explain how her experience with water scarcity had informed key elements of the moisture detection algorithms. Another, whose family had farmed the same land in Georgia for 7 generations, described how traditional knowledge about seasonal weather patterns had been incorporated into the predictive models. Watching from the sidelines, Dr. Montgomery felt a profound sense of validation. The rural expertise that Westridge had once systematically excluded was now driving innovation at the very heart of the institution. Students whose brilliance might never have been recognized under the old system were now standing at the forefront of technological advancement, their unique perspectives enriching rather than diminishing academic rigor. As the demonstration concluded, President Johnson addressed the gathering. "What you've witnessed this morning is more than impressive technology. It's the embodiment of Westridge's transformed understanding of knowledge and innovation. These systems represent the power of connecting different worlds, the practical wisdom of those who work the land with the theoretical frameworks of advanced engineering." She gestured toward the Mason Center, now gleaming in the morning sun. 25 years ago, we might have dismissed these ideas because they originated outside our traditional academic pathways. Today, we recognize that true excellence emerges precisely at these intersections, where different knowledge systems meet and inform each other. Following the drone demonstration, the commemoration shifted to a more intimate gathering in the Mason Center's grand circular hall. Educational leaders from across the globe assembled for a panel discussion titled "From Exclusion to Innovation: The Next 25 Years." On the dais sat figures who represented different facets of the educational transformation: Dr. Olivia Mason, Dr. Montgomery, President Johnson, Dr. Melissa Rivera, the first Mason scholar who was now leading drought adaptation research, and William Mason, whose presence was greeted with a standing ovation. At 96, William Mason spoke rarely in public now, conserving his energy carefully. But when the moderator asked him to reflect on the beginning of this journey, He leaned toward the microphone with characteristic directness. "I didn't set out to transform education," he said, his voice still carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms. "I simply believed that brilliance deserves recognition, regardless of its packaging." When my granddaughter was rejected, not because her achievements were insufficient, but because they came wrapped in rural experience rather than prep school polish, I saw not just a personal injustice, but a systemic blindness. He paused, looking out at the audience packed with students, faculty, and visitors. "The most important innovation isn't a technology or a theory. It's our capacity to recognize potential in unexpected places." For too long, elite education measured excellence by how closely it resembled itself, creating a closed loop that excluded more brilliance than it nurtured. The moderator turned to Dr. Montgomery. "As someone who once upheld that traditional system and then became a champion for its transformation, what would you identify as the most significant change in our understanding of excellence?" Montgomery considered the question carefully. "We used to evaluate students based on how well they'd fit into our existing institutional culture, essentially selecting for sameness while calling it merit. Now we evaluate based on what unique perspectives and approaches they might contribute, selecting for the diversity of thought that drives genuine innovation." He gestured toward the Mason scholars in the audience. "These brilliant young people aren't succeeding despite their rural backgrounds. They're succeeding because their experiences have given them insights and problem-solving approaches that can't be developed in more homogeneous environments. What we once dismissed as a limitation has proven to be an invaluable asset." President Johnson nodded in agreement. "The data is conclusive. Our most innovative research emerges from teams with the greatest diversity of background and perspective. By expanding our definition of excellence, we haven't diluted it, we've enriched it immeasurably." The conversation shifted to the future, with Dr. Olivia Mason outlining her vision for the next phase of rural innovation. "We're moving beyond simply identifying brilliant individuals from underrepresented backgrounds and giving them access to existing systems. The next frontier is creating entirely new knowledge frameworks that integrate different approaches to understanding and solving problems." She described initiatives already underway, collaborative research networks connecting traditional ecological knowledge with advanced data science, innovation hubs in rural communities designed to nurture local talent in place rather than extracting it. Educational models that validated multiple paths to expertise rather than privileging a single narrow track. "For generations," she explained, "we've assumed that knowledge flows primarily from elite institutions outward. The most exciting development I see is the growing recognition that groundbreaking insights can and do emerge from communities previously excluded from academic consideration, not just rural areas, but any place where direct experience with complex challenges drives innovative thinking." As the panel concluded, an unexpected guest was invited to speak. Sophia Mason, Olivia's 19-year-old daughter and William's great-granddaughter. Currently a sophomore at Westridge, studying environmental systems engineering, she represented the generational impact of the changes set in motion 25 years earlier. With poise reminiscent of her mother, Sophia addressed the gathering. "For my generation, the changes you've been discussing aren't revolutionary. They're simply the world we've grown up in. I can't imagine a Westridge that would reject a student because their brilliance didn't fit a narrow preconception of what excellence looks like." She smiled at her great-grandfather. "When my mother was rejected by Westridge, it was because the institution couldn't see the value in her rural perspective. When I was admitted, it was partially because of that same perspective. The difference isn't in our family's capabilities, It's in how institutions have learned to recognize excellence in its many forms. Following the panel, attendees moved to the Mason Center's rooftop garden for the final event of the commemoration, a demonstration of the integrated water and energy systems that made the building not only carbon neutral but regenerative, actually improving the surrounding environment rather than merely minimizing harm. As sunshine streamed through specially designed solar collection panels that doubled as shade structures, William Mason found himself approached by a young woman he didn't recognize, a first-year Mason scholar from a small farming community in Oklahoma. "Mr. Mason," she began somewhat nervously, "I wanted to thank you personally. My great-grandfather worked your family's land back in the 1960s. He always told stories about how you valued his knowledge about soil and water patterns, even though he never finished high school." Mason looked surprised. "What was his name?" "Thomas Jenkins," she replied. "He said you once told the agricultural engineers to stop talking and start listening when he explained why their irrigation design wouldn't work on the North Fields." Mason's eyes lit with recognition. "Tom Jenkins. Of course I remember. He knew more about that land from working it than any expert with a degree. He's the one who showed us how to redirect the seasonal runoff to create natural irrigation channels." He smiled warmly. "What's your field of study?" "Hydrogeology with a focus on aquifer restoration," she answered, her initial nervousness giving way to enthusiasm. "I've been developing a system that combines traditional knowledge about underground water sources with new sensing technologies. Professor Williams says it could help restore depleted aquifers across the Great Plains." As they continued talking, Dr. Montgomery observed the interaction from across the garden, a perfect embodiment of the generational impact of Westridge's transformation. The rural knowledge that had once been valued only by practical necessity was now being recognized for its scientific significance, translated into formal systems through the brilliance of students who might never have had the opportunity to develop their ideas in earlier times. Later that evening, as the commemoration events concluded, the Mason family gathered for a private dinner in the center's small dining room. 4 generations sat around the table: William, his daughter Patricia, Olivia's mother, Olivia and her husband, their children including Sophia, and even Sophia's infant son, sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside her chair. President Johnson and Dr. Montgomery had been invited to join them, creating a circle that connected the past confrontation with the present collaboration. As they shared stories and reflections, the atmosphere was one of both celebration and contemplation, an acknowledgement of how far they had come and how much still remained to be done. "I've been thinking about legacy," William said during a quiet moment, looking around the table at his family. "Not buildings or endowments, but the kind of change that outlasts us. 25 years ago, I was angry about an injustice to my granddaughter. I never imagined that challenging that injustice would lead to all of this." He reached for Olivia's hand. "Your rejection turned out to be one of the most consequential moments in educational history, not because you needed Westridge, but because other students needed the changes that your story catalyzed." Dr. Montgomery nodded in agreement. "The institutions we build outlive us, which makes it all the more important that we build them with the wisdom to evolve. Westridge existed for nearly 2 centuries before our confrontation forced it to examine its fundamental assumptions. Now it stands as a model for a different kind of excellence, one defined by inclusion rather than exclusion, by curiosity rather than certainty." As they concluded the evening, President Johnson presented William with a small metal plaque that would be installed beside the Convergence sculpture the following day. It read simply, "On this spot in 2025, a private jet landed and a journey began. The courage to challenge, the wisdom to listen, and the vision to imagine a better way transformed not just one institution, but our understanding of excellence itself." The following morning, as the Mason family prepared to depart, William asked to be taken to the athletic field one last time. As his wheelchair was positioned beside the Convergence sculpture, he gazed across the campus that had once represented an impenetrable barrier to his granddaughter's aspirations, and now stood as a global center for inclusive excellence. Students crossed the green on their way to classes, a visibly diverse community, not just in appearance, but in background, perspective, and approach. The Mason Center gleamed in the morning sun, its sustainable design a physical embodiment of the philosophy it represented. Innovation emerging from the integration of different knowledge systems. Olivia joined her grandfather, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" William smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. "I'm thinking about that day we landed here. How angry I was at the arrogance of an institution that couldn't see your brilliance because it came in an unfamiliar package." He gestured toward the campus. "And I'm thinking how beautifully that anger was transformed into something constructive, not just for you, but for generations of students whose potential might otherwise have been overlooked. It wasn't just your landing the jet that made the difference," Olivia observed. "It was that Chancellor Montgomery chose to listen rather than merely defend. The confrontation was necessary, but so was the willingness to grow beyond it." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Montgomery approached, accompanied by a group of current Mason scholars. "Before you go," he said, "these students wanted to share something with you." One by one, the scholars introduced themselves and briefly described their work: innovative approaches to water conservation, soil regeneration, climate adaptation, and sustainable food systems. Each project represented a unique synthesis of traditional rural knowledge and cutting-edge scientific methods, exactly the kind of bridge-building innovation that Olivia's research had pioneered. The final student, a young man from a small farming community in Idaho, handed William a small wooden box. Inside was a vial of soil, a sample gathered from each of the communities represented by the current Mason scholars. "This represents what you helped us understand," the student explained. "That the soil itself, what you were told, wasn't sophisticated. Enough for Westridge, contains wisdom accumulated over generations. The future of innovation isn't just in laboratories or lecture halls, but in the knowledge embedded in the land and the communities that work it." As William Mason's private jet lifted off from the same field where it had landed 25 years earlier, this time with formal permission and ceremony, Dr. Richard Montgomery stood watching its departure. The journey that had begun with confrontation and embarrassment had evolved into one of the most meaningful transformations in educational history. The administrator, who had once dismissed rural environmental expertise as inherently less valuable than traditional academic credentials, now recognized that innovation thrived at the intersection of different knowledge systems. The standard-bearer for exclusive excellence had become the champion for a more expansive vision of human potential. And it had all begun with a moment of disruption, a private jet landing on a carefully manicured athletic field, a grandfather defending his granddaughter's dignity, and an institution forced to confront the limitations of its own definition of excellence. What could have ended with hardened positions and mutual resentment had instead blossomed into collaboration, growth, and a profound reimagining of what education at its best could be. As the jet disappeared from view, President Johnson joined Montgomery on the field. "Quite a legacy," she observed, looking from the departing aircraft to the Mason Center and the campus beyond. "Yes," Montgomery agreed, "but not the legacy any of us would have predicted." William built his company, but his greatest contribution turned out to be challenging an educational system that couldn't recognize his granddaughter's brilliance. Olivia developed groundbreaking environmental research, but her most profound impact came from being rejected rather than accepted. "And you?" Johnson asked. Montgomery smiled. "I spent half my career designing systems to exclude students who didn't fit my narrow definition of excellence. I'll spend the rest of it trying to ensure that no institution makes that mistake again." He looked across the campus that had been transformed by the courage to question its most fundamental assumptions. Sometimes our greatest contribution isn't what we build, but what we're willing to dismantle when we recognize it no longer serves its purpose. As they walked back toward the administration building, students crossed their path, future scientists, engineers, policymakers, and innovators from backgrounds that spanned the full diversity of human experience. Each carried unique perspectives shaped by their communities and experiences. Each represented potential that might once have been overlooked by institutions too narrow in their vision of excellence. And each was a living testament to the power of transformation that began with three simple words: "not soil and crops," spoken dismissively in an admissions office, challenged by a private jet landing where it didn't belong, and ultimately transcended through the collaborative effort to build a more inclusive vision of human potential and possibility. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.